Okay, so we're going to start today on exercise 215, and this is the first day that we're actually going to start to get in a real environment. And it's real to some extent, but the lighting will forever be a lot better than it was. Let's put it that way. But this whole environment thing is actually going to take place over 2 lectures because we'll add in some more complexity next class. Today we'll deal with the kind of the first cursory setup. We're also going to deal with putting your skyscraper into a block of the city of San Francisco so that we can actually get your city in some context for rendering. I recognize that today also happens to be the 220 review, so there's a large number of you that are quite stressed out, and I get that. And that's a good thing, because that's what you're here to do, is stress out and not sleep. And so as a result, it's not that, it's pretty light exercise. There's not too much that you have to do, so you guys can kind of get prepped for your review and all that kind of stuff, which, you know, thank me later, right? So let's get started. A couple things here. First off, we do need to make sure that you're logged into the course website. And if you go to today's exercise, there we go. Toward the bottom, there is a download sfdowntown.3dm for part 2. So you want to make sure that you click on this, which is going to take you to a Dropbox page. You don't have to sign up. You just need to get to where you can download it and say direct download to your computer. You don't have to download it to Dropbox. The reason that I'm asking you to do this now is it's a fairly large file. It's 62 megabytes. So it's going to take a little while to download, so you can kind of have that going in the background while you're working on the rest of the stuff. So we start by downloading that file. We'll come back to it in just a second. And then I'm going to go ahead and open up my file from last class, which was my skyscraper. And I had it here. I already did a fair amount of the prep last class because I brought it into that exercise 208 sample scene. If you did not do the prep on it just yet, now's the time to start getting it ready to use as a block. So in the interest of going through that, I'm going to open up a new file and create a quick little skyscraper. It won't be as exotic as this one, just to show you that the application of materials and stuff. So I'm going to do a very generic building. So I'll put it at 0, 0, and it'll be at 100 feet, comma 200 feet. And it's going to be 600 feet tall. There we go. I'm going to look at it in shaded mode so that I can see it. And now I need to apply materials to this. Let me also clean up my layer stack. So we'll start my default layer we'll call skyscraper. And you could do this with the building that you worked on last class. I'll have a layer for skin. Let's change this object onto the skin layer. We'll make that a sub-layer of the skyscraper layer. We'll have another layer for floor. Again, a sub-layer. We'll have another sub-layer for ceiling. Let me make the floor layer active. This is a perfect rectangle, so my life is pretty easy to build this. So bear with me for just a second. Move vertical by 24 feet. And then array 1 in the X, 1 in the Y, and 37 in the Z. And my spacing is going to be at 16 feet. And there's all of my floors. And then we'll take this first one here. I'm going to copy it vertically -4 feet. There it is. And then I'll array that one after I change it to the ceiling layer. And 37. And it's once again at 16 feet. Okay, so there's my floors and my ceilings and my skin. This is essentially what you did. Obviously, this is a very basic building, but it doesn't matter. You guys have more complicated buildings. I just needed an example to go through. So I have a skyscraper layer. I have a skin, a floor, and a ceiling layer. I'm going to get rid of these other 2 layers so it's nice and clean. There's nothing else in my file. Now would be the time to apply the materials to this. So I'll go into my V-Ray materials, and I'm going to load up concrete for the floor. Sorry. All right. I'm going to apply this to the floor layer, apply material to layer, and it'll go on the floor. I will right click and say load material, and I'll do my wall. Interior wall. There it is. Texture sheetrock white. Apply material to layer. We'll put that on the ceiling layer. And the last one that I'm going to load is the skyscraper light or dark material. So let me go to my glass, and we'll go to skyscraper. I'll do skyscraper dark for now. And I'm going to apply that skyscraper dark to my skin layer. And so we'll put it on the skin layer. At this point, I can switch over into my rendered mode so we can kind of get a sense of what it's looking like here. And actually, the top of this, let me explode it for a second. And let me join the skin layer. The very top should really be on the floor layer, not on the, it shouldn't be glass on the top. So, okay, so now I need to make sure I texture map my sides here. This texture was designed to be a 4 foot by 4 foot by 16 feet tall texture map. So when I go ahead and create my mapping on this, I'll go to texture mapping. I'll go to apply box mapping. We'll do a bounding box, world, and it doesn't matter whether it's capped or not. And then I'm going to show my mapping widget. There it is. And now I need to do some scaling. So we'll scale 1D. And we'll shrink this down to be 4 feet on that side. We'll do the same thing right there and shrink that down to be 4 feet. So I have a little 4 foot by 4 foot. And you can see it, the divisions of the glass starting to show up. And then I need to scale it down vertically. So we're going to scale again in 1D from the bottom all the way up to the top, right there. And that should be at 16 feet. And I also need to move this so that this shows up at the first floor. Actually, it shows up there, I think. Yeah, right like that. So we should see the glass panels up above. I know that the material shows it as being transparent here. It's actually the opposite. It's solid. I don't know why the preview is wrong, but it is. So now that I have this set up, I have my materials applied, I have my texture maps done, I'll go ahead and save this as my skyscraper. I'll go to File and then Save. And I'm just going to call this skyscraper 2. And I'll save. Remember, there's nothing else. It's nice and clean. I want to use it as a block, and I don't want to bring anything else in with it. So no infinite planes, nothing special for rendering, no environments, no lights, just this building itself. That's saved. Now, by now, my skyscraper file, or my San Francisco downtown file should have downloaded. So I'll go ahead and open that one up. It probably somewhere behind here gives us a few messages. It might even ask us to update the materials. I'm not sure. No, it doesn't look like it did. And so in this scene, you have to be a little on the patient side. This is not a file that I created. It's a file that I got from some of the grad students at UC Berkeley a while back. It's not the best file. It's also not the most up-to-date file, but it is the city of San Francisco, so we can use it. So don't be looking for any new buildings in here because it's a little bit older. It is also a mesh file. It's not a NURBS file, so that makes it a little bit slower. We dealt with the SketchUp mesh files. It's the same kind of thing. converting this is a whole lot more complicated than converting a SketchUp terrain. So I've never gone through the effort of doing it. We've left it as a mesh. It will still render just fine, but working with it isn't too nice. So anyway, if anybody knows of a better San Francisco file, I'm all ears, but I don't have one. So here it is. And you can kind of see that we lose some of it on the outskirts. I've picked a building site for us to work with, and I've made your life easier. I'm going to turn off the SF model for a second by giving you a nice little foundation to put your building on. This little blue square allows you to stick your building really easily into this particular scene. If you turn off the SF City model, it makes it a lot easier to work with. So if you're feeling like it's really hard to scroll around and whatever, you can go ahead and turn off that SF City model, and now you have just the little foundation to work with, which makes it a lot easier. I'm going to zoom selected on that. And now that I have this particular piece, it's time to bring in my building. So I'll go to the Edit menu, I'll go to Blocks, and I'll go to Insert Block Instance, and I'm going to go find my building. So we'll go into today's folder. Actually, it was yesterday's folder. Sorry, helps if I get the numbers right. There it is. I'm going to put my simple one in, and then I'll replace it with the larger one a little bit later. I'll go ahead and say Open. I'll say OK. Remember, I want to link my files and have my layer style as a reference. And we'll go ahead and say OK. And I can drop my building on top. Let me turn on Object Snap and snap to the end. And depending on what my orientation would be, I'm snapping to one of the corners. Because Market Street is on a diagonal, this building needs to also be on a diagonal, so I'm going to have to rotate it after the fact. So I've dropped it in as a block, but then I will have to go up to Transform and then Rotate, or just type Rotate. And we'll rotate this so that it lines up. If your base is 100 by 200, it lines up perfectly. If it's not, it doesn't. You can work with it. So once I have the building installed, I could turn back on the city of San Francisco, and we can see my building in its context. It's difficult to get a really nice view looking at your building, so I've set up a couple for you. I have perspective 1 and 2 under the set view. I have perspective 1, which is a street view, and then I have perspective 2, which is another perspective view that's kind of looking down Market Street-ish. One of the things to be careful of is as you try to set up these views, if you get yourself back too far, you're going to be inside another building. And so you have to be kind of aware of that and how you set it up. I haven't taught you yet how to manipulate the camera independently of the views. We'll get to that, which is how it's easier to set it up because you can control where that point is. The views that I've given you are at street level looking toward your building. They tend to be a far more effective rendering view than a view that's up above looking down on your building like this. Unless you're floating around in an airplane or a blimp or something, you rarely see a city from this perspective. You generally see it from lower. And so in this context, I'm going to encourage you to do renderings from street level. We'll still get it so you can see the whole building, and I'll show you how to change the rendering to see it. But that level looking up at the building is how you're really going to see the building. And so doing the renderings that way is nice. If you really want to do one aerial version looking down, I'm OK with that. But you can't do all of your views in that strategy. OK, so we've got the building, and we've got it into a scene. I mentioned in the handout here that we can convert the background into something called a V-Ray proxy object. And this is something that is a little hit or miss as to whether it works. I believe that they've improved it a great deal for the newer versions of V-Ray, but I at least like to introduce you to the concept of it. But for right now, I'm going to skip over it and come back to it in case it decides to crash on my computer. So I'd rather teach you the rest of the stuff, and then we'll come back to it. The purpose of a V-Ray proxy object is for geometry that is very repetitive or really big and difficult to work with, i.e. the city of San Francisco. You can make it an object that only V-Ray sees, and when you do the rendering, that object shows up. When you work in Rhino, that object isn't there anymore. So it's essentially like keeping the city of San Francisco without actually having to keep the city of San Francisco in your file. So it can be really useful in some contexts. For right now, we're going to skip over it. I'll come back to that a little bit later on. But at this point, I need to actually set up a sun and sky system for this particular file. So I need a time of day, and I need to be able to do the renderings at a particular time of day. So I'm going to open up the V-Ray Options toolbar here. Remember, if you don't have your V-Ray toolbars showing, you can go to the Tools toolbar layout, and then click on File, and then Open, and load that V-Ray toolbar. You can also go up to the V-Ray menu and choose Options from there. So in my V-Ray Options editor, I'm going to come down to the actually, I don't need to do this quite yet. Sorry. Let's put the sun in first, and then we'll come back to the environment. It would have been out of order. So in the V-Ray Options bar, or toolbar here, there's a button for sun. Add Sunlight System is what we're going to do. I'm going to go ahead and click on this button, and it brings up the dialog box called the Sun Angle Calculator. And so someday, when you transfer to Berkeley and you take Architecture 140, which is the Energy and Environmental Systems class, you'll talk all about real sun angle calculators and what they mean and that sort of thing. We're not going to worry about it. We're actually going to uncheck manual control and give Rhino some control and scroll down a bit. So once you've unchecked manual control, we're going to come down here, and we're going to choose under Find Place, San Francisco. So I'll type in San Francisco, and you'll see it on the list. Makes our life really easy. We don't need to know any information there. I will select it in blue, and it brings in the latitude and longitude for the city of San Francisco. I'm then going to scroll up and look at the date and time sliders. I could click on the Now button, and it's supposed to set it for today's date and today's time. I think the renderings tend to be a little bit better, and again, this is a lighting preference, earlier in the morning or late in the afternoon. You get a little bit longer shadows. I'm going to go a little bit later in the afternoon. I can specify a specific date. This happens to be today. And I can specify a specific time. So I could say I want it to be precisely 3:30 p.m. in the afternoon. Also, if we're in daylight savings time, right here, we can turn on daylight savings time or turn off daylight savings time if you want to compensate for daylight savings. So I have that set up. I have my time and date set up. All of that's good. What that has done when I changed the date and time is it's changed the sun position and changed the sun angle. I could manually do this too, but why? So I go ahead and I have that set up. When I'm done, I'll say OK. Now this is a mistake that a lot of people do, is at this point they say, great, my sun's set up. Well, it's not quite yet because you haven't actually inserted the sun into your scene. Notice at your command line, it's asking you for a position. This is where do you want your sun to go. I recommend either putting it at 0, 0, 0 or putting it near your object or on top of your object. In this case, I'll snap to the corner of my object right there, and there we go. Now I have my sun inserted into the scene. It looks just like the directional lights that we've worked with before. The difference being that it's a far more powerful light. If you put your sun into the scene and you're unhappy with its angle, calculation, date, time, etc., you can select it, which I have, then go to your properties. Under the light properties, this replaced the texture mapping. So for a light, we're replacing it with the texture mapping, or we're replacing the texture mapping button with the light. We can click on the big button for Modify Sun, uncheck manual control, go back through the process for San Francisco. There it is. Scroll back up, and you know what? Maybe I'll pick the morning. Maybe I'll pick 9 in the morning. When I'm done, I'll go ahead and say OK, and you'll see that my sun changes for 9 in the morning. So I can modify the sun. I should also, under Layers, create a layer called Environment with a sublayer for sun. I should then put the sun on that layer. This makes selecting the sun much easier because you can always right-click on the sun layer and say Select Objects, and you will get the sun and be able to modify it. OK, so I have the sun positioned correctly in my scene. It's now time to assign an environment. At this point, I'll go up to the V-Ray Options right here. I'll go to the Environment tab, which you've done before. And for the GI skylight and the reflection and refraction background, for both of them, I'm going to click on the map, the M next to it. So GI skylight, I'll come over here to the lowercase m, and I'll click on it. Over here, it says none right below preview. I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to scroll down until I see texsky out of that list. When I see texsky, it doesn't mean this is a Texas sky. It just means that it's a textured sky. And so I'll click on texsky, and under the sky options here, it says default sky options, sun, none. Well, I do have a sun in my scene. So I need to go ahead and click on that. And I have two options to pick. One is called the Rhino document sun, and the other is a really long string of numbers. You're going to pick the one that's the really long string of numbers because that's the sun we just inserted into the scene. Question? You must have two suns in your scene, or two lights in your scene. So I'll go ahead and pick it. And there it is. I'll help you find the other light a little bit later on. So I've picked it. I don't need to worry about any of the rest of the options. I just need to tie it to that sun, and I'll say OK. I'll do the same thing for the reflection and refraction background. So I'll click on the M. I'll go in down to texsky. There it is. I'll choose my sun. There it is. And I'll go ahead and say OK. So I've assigned that in the environment for both the GI skylight and for the reflection refraction background. And what this has done is it's given me ambient light based on the sun, so reflected light, and also it's changed the sky so that it's no longer a white sky or a black sky or a blue sky. It fades from what you would see on the horizon. See, if we look out there, out the window, see how it's lighter blue on the horizon, and as we go steeper, it gets darker? That's what it's going to do. It's going to mimic that based on the time of day. So I have those two things set up. It's now time for me to go ahead and do my rendering. So I'm going to first go File and then Save As, and save this into today's folder just in case something decides to crash on me when I do the rendering. This is exercise 215 for fall of 2018. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and switch my view. I'm going to go to Set View, and I'll switch over to Perspective 2. I'm seeing the base of my building. When I do the rendering, right now, I'm going to get a rendering that's showing essentially what I'm seeing on the screen. I'd really like to see more of my building. So I can go into the options, and I can change the output options here. And instead of being stuck with a width and a height value, I can actually change the width. I can leave this the same, but I could set the height much taller. So maybe 1200. This is going to make a tall, skinny rendering rather than a wide rendering. So I can change that. We'll give that a shot. There's one other thing that's going to be messed up before I can do my rendering, and that is that if I were to render right now, it would turn out almost entirely white. And actually, for purposes of illustration, let me make this small. And do a quick render for you. It's always bad when I say quick render, right? Come on. So I know this is really small, but essentially all I get is a white square. And that's because my camera is no longer properly exposed. This is the first time we've ever had a sun in the scene. And so the sun is, by its nature, really, really bright. And if we were to walk outside right now and take a picture with a camera, we would have to adjust the camera such that we could see something in the picture. We have to do the same thing in V-Ray. I'm going to go back to my options, my V-Ray options, and I'm going to go to the Camera tab right here. Under Camera, I'm going to look at Physical Camera, and I'm going to turn it on. So I'm using a camera now to expose the scene correctly. The only thing we really worry about is shutter speed. This is how long the exposure is. If your scene is too dark, you decrease this value. If your scene is too light, you increase this value. It's really easy. So once it's on and it's ready to render, I'll do another really small render so you can see it. So I know it's blurry, but a lot of times doing a small render like this is useful because you can kind of test out and see, am I getting generally what I want? And so in this case, yeah, I'm getting generally what I want, but I'm actually not getting the top of my building yet. I'm still getting it clipped off. So I'd like to go back in to my V-Ray options. I'll go back to my output, and I'll say that, you know what, I want this more like 150. And I can do another practice small render. And I highly encourage you to do these small practice renders because they will give us a much better understanding without having to waste too much computer resources. So there I can already see I'm getting the top of my building. So I'm pretty happy with the rendering. I've got extra space at the top and the bottom, but I can crop that out in Photoshop later. So OK, that's reasonable. The SF background here probably should have some kind of a material on it. I'm not looking for a photorealistic background. That's too much work to actually apply textures to all the buildings and get a photorealistic background. So instead, I would suggest some kind of a white background texture. It's default right now, but one of the textures that I like, should be preloaded for you, is a white porcelain. It has just a little bit of shine. It looks kind of like you built a model, a physical model, and you took a picture of it. And so I like that one. I'm going to go ahead and right-click and apply that material to the SF downtown layer. Or sorry, excuse me, the SF model layer. There we go. That's been applied. And I'm ready to up the size of the rendering. So I can go into my V-Ray options, and I can come over here. I've got the 150 by 32. Seems like a reasonable size. I can lock that aspect ratio and then increase one of these values. So I could say maybe 1500, and it'll change to 319 there. I could change this value to something, I don't know, 500, and this value would go up accordingly. So once you've locked the aspect ratio, it's easy. You can just change one of the values. I'm going to drop that size a little bit. I don't need that much. So at this point, I'm ready to perform a rendering. This rendering is borderline being useful to use the distributed rendering network. Could I do it on a computer? Sure, single computer. Would it finish in maybe 5 to 10 minutes? Yeah, probably. Okay, that's a reasonable amount of time to wait. The more complex the building gets, the more complex the materials get, the more complex the rendering gets, the more likely it is that you're going to want to start distributed rendering. Next class, for sure, we'll use distributed rendering because of the background. But I want to introduce the concept and kind of walk you through it several times because it takes a little bit of getting used to. So I do have everything ready. I could perform the rendering right now without doing anything more. If I want to turn on distributed rendering, I just wrote up a little tutorial. It's V-Ray 8.30, so it's not in the book. It's just here. By the way, everything else that I did cover is under V-Ray, and I have links to them. They are right here, 8.17 for the sun, 8.18 for the sky, and 8.19 for the physical camera. Those three are what I just did. So if you want to go through any one of those, or if I went too fast, you can go back and review those there. And 8.30 is the distributed network rendering. This is specific to the ET lab. So if you have V-Ray at home and you try to do network rendering, it's not going to help you. So it is specific to being here on the lab computers. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my V-Ray options again. So here I am, V-Ray options. I'm going to click on the system drawer right here. And with the system drawer open, I'm going to look for distributed rendering, and I'm going to check it to turn it on. So the first thing I have to do is turn it on to begin with. So now it's on, and it's going to want to borrow other computers. And so many of you have seen that when you first start up your computer, this little thing shows up. And it looks kind of like, why do I need that? And a lot of people close it. Okay, so here's your moment where you need to learn not to close it. You need to believe in karma, and you need to tell all your friends never to close it, because you're going to want to leave it on to help you guys later on. So it should stay open, and that's great. It's open. To access this on all the computers, we need to actually choose who our hosts are going to be. So if I click on this button next to hosts, I get this V-Ray distributed rendering settings dialog box. The first thing that I'll do is click on the Find Servers button. And when I click on that, at least one server will come up. And that's your own server. There it is. One unused DR spawner. That means a server. Would you like to add them? Yes. That's my computer. Well, it doesn't really help to do a network render with only your computer. That defeats the purpose. We would like more than just my computer. Unfortunately, due to security issues in the campus labs, they've made it so that we can't just automatically find them. You used to be able to just find all the network, and it would find all the computers for you, and you didn't have to do anything. A little more work this semester, and that's unfortunate, but it is what it is. So at my prodding, the IT department did build a specific render box for us, a render farm that we can access. I can add that by clicking on Add Server. And right here in the Enter Host name, I can type in Render Farm and say OK. That is a computer that's on the network that is equipped to do renderings for us. I think it has 12 or 16 threads of rendering. The bad news about that is only one of us can use it at a time. So if all of us are trying to render and we all go to Render Farm, it doesn't necessarily help. However, if you're here when it's not class time, always hit Render Farm first, because it's there just waiting to do renderings. That's its purpose. So that one's there, and it's loaded. If I want to add more individual computers, I can do it. It just takes a little bit of work. I need to be able to know what the IP addresses of the computers are in the lab. And I can do that in one of two ways. Number one, they haven't changed, so if you write them down, you don't have to do any of this work. But if you don't know what it is, you can open up the command prompt, and you can do that by searching Windows for CMD. It'll open up the command prompt. And right here in the command prompt, you type ipconfig, if I can type correctly, and it will give us information about our network. Right here under IPv4 address is the address of my computer, 10.24.199.3. That's this particular machine. This lab is numbered 1 through 33 on the computers. The number here doesn't necessarily correspond to the number on your monitor. Like my number, my station is ET103-01, but my IP address is .3. Go figure, it is what it is. But now that I know 10.24.199.3, I can come back, click on Add Server, 10.24.199, if I can type, dot any number between 1 and 33, except mine. It doesn't make sense to add my own. So I could do 10.1 and say OK. I could click on Add Server, 10.24.199.2. I could add server. I could do 10.24.199.12, for example. I could add server 10.24.199.32. Say OK. Not all of these are going to be available for me to use, but some of them will be. I would recommend for a medium-sized rendering, something like this, doing no more than 5. If you do more than 5, unless you're doing a really big, powerful rendering that's going to take some time anyway, it wastes too much time distributing the assets to the computers and then waiting for data to come back. So it's great if you have a really big rendering with a lot of complexity to it. Otherwise, you will spend too much time waiting for stuff to come back. Once I have those listed in here, I'll check the boxes next to them, like that, and I'll click on this Resolve Servers button, which will actually get the IP addresses for all of these servers. That's fine. It's pretty obvious because I typed them in anyway, but it would do it. For Render Farm, it translates Render Farm into the actual IP address of the Render Farm server. I'll go ahead and say OK at this point, and I now have distributed rendering set up and ready to work. It's possible that V-Ray crashes when you do it, which it may have just done for me, but we'll see. So I have that set up. Now I'm ready to do my rendering. I'll go ahead and click on the R to start the rendering, and I'm going to show you a few things about the rendering as it starts up. OK, so I can confirm that it's working because I'm seeing numbers inside of my little threads or my little squares. I can also take a look at this box here. And right there is where I started my render, preparing render. And as I come down here, it says, here's the different hosts. Was I able to connect to those hosts? Yes, using 6 hosts for distributed rendering. OK, that's good. So it was able to find those hosts, and it's starting to use them. Down here, when it says setting up 8 threads, it's loading up these bitmap files, and it's sending out. These are files relating to my materials or my blocks, and it's sending all of those files to the other computers so that they can perform the rendering. This is the part that can take some time. So if your rendering is not that big, and it's not that complex, you'll never actually get to the point where you've sent all that data to the computers and get anything logical back. When your rendering is more complex with more stuff in it, this is useful because you have more time during the rendering. So we'll see if mine ever decides to actually load the rest of the pieces. It may not be complex enough because this is not a particularly complex building to actually get those to load. If it loads, I'll get more than just these little squares showing up. So there's an example. My computer was able to finish it faster than the time it took to send out the files to the other computers and get data back. So it goes back, and it's setting up the threads again for the final pass of the rendering. So this file is a lot bigger. It doesn't necessarily look much better here, but if I zoom in, we can start to see the detail. We can see the glass, for example, the little divisions in the glass. And I could up the size of this rendering and make it even larger. So our purpose today is to actually get the sun to be set up, to get our physical camera to do the exposure, to get our block that represents our building into the city of San Francisco scene, and to be able to perform your first rendering of this scene. You'll notice that the sky in the background here goes from light to dark, and that's based on the time of day. If I change the time of day, that sky will change. If it's closer to noon, it'll be a little bit lighter. And you can do side-by-side renderings if you want to see that happen. OK, so what I want you to do at the end is to post this image as your featured image, so you get a rendering out. For those of you that are in 220, good luck this afternoon. I know you're going to be more concentrating on that. If I had to recommend anything, I would recommend getting yourself a little bit of food before you go into that. I wouldn't recommend taking a nap. That's not a good plan. At this point, you should just go for it. Do also take a little bit, sorry for those of you not in 220, but I'm just trying to help them out. When you go into your review, think ahead about what you want to talk about. This is a mid-review, so it's a perfect example. Remember, it's not a graded mid-review. This is a perfect example for you to get feedback from other people. So find the areas that you really want feedback on and try to focus the reviewers on that topic so you get feedback on that particular thing. Remember, this one is not about winning. It's not about having the best project. It's about learning the most. The best mid-review is the person who learns the most. Does that make sense? So take that to heart when you guys are doing your review today. Any other questions? No? All right. I'll let you go.